Hello, my name is Pearce, and today I'm going to be talking about Indian boarding schools, and more specifically the traditional narrative as well as the elevated and silence perspectives from these Indian boarding schools. So, firstly, getting into the traditional narrative, basically these schools were an effort to quote unquote civilize Native Americans, or in other words, like basically force them to assimilate to the Euro American white culture at the time. And believe it or not, these boarding schools were seen as a progressive act at the time, as the alternative, or most others just believed or wanted to just eliminate Native Americans altogether instead of um, giving them a chance, I guess you could say. So these people even said these boarding schools were seen as a benevolent experiment. In other words, like a productive and positive experience that uh, gave the Native Americans a chance to mix and thrive in the Euro American white culture, at least from the white perspective. So, about the boarding schools more specifically, these schools are ran by the federal government and as well as the church or various Christian religious organizations. And specifically the Carlisle boarding school was the first boarding school to be made, in which they would separate the children from their siblings and families, cut their hair, assign them uniforms, and exclusively taught them English and prevented any other sort of native language speaking at all. It was solely English. And this, I thought this quote was interesting here by Richard Henry Pratt that says, "Kill the Indian, save the man," which I thought was interesting because to me it makes me feel like the white people believe that they were doing the Indians a favor and were saving them, kind of similar to how I guess conservative Christian religions would try to quote unquote save homosexuals from being gay and try to get rid of the evil or get rid of the sin. I feel like it's a similar thing here where they're almost speaking of being Indian as a disease, and they're trying to save them. They're trying to get rid of the Indian and save them to become a normal person in the white Euro American culture perspective. And then getting into the silence perspectives, obviously it's the Native Americans, as most instances in American history. It's the white people is the traditional narrative, and then the other side is the silence perspectives. So as I mentioned, like these Native Americans went through a lot in these boarding schools, separated from their family, forced to speak English, and if they weren't they would be punished. As like this quote from Roy Smith says that they would mix soap with water and have them rinse their mouth out with it if they spoke anything other than English. And from these schools, there was actually a lot of deaths found and a lot of unmarked graves. Which for each of those unmarked graves, that's just another perspective that's not only been silenced but just eliminated altogether. Which is obviously really unfortunate, and not only those people, but all the people who were successfully brainwashed by all the Native Americans that were successfully brainwashed by these boarding schools. Basically, the Native Americans that they were, or the Native Americans in them, that perspective is dead. That also doesn't exist. So those might as well be more unmarked graves, because we'll never hear those perspectives, because they've been so brainwashed into rejecting Native American culture and only accepting the white culture. So, and then getting into my personal schooling experience with the Indian boarding schools, I was actually in high school. I was taught a little bit about the Indian boarding schools, and I was actually shown both perspectives. Firstly, the factual perspective of like all the numbers and just straight up what happened from a completely objective perspective, as well as seeing videos of these Native Americans' experiences in these boarding schools and how they were mistreated and how they were brainwashed and how they were, forced to assimilate into the white culture, basically. And I believe that this should actually be the standard for all schools, not only for the Indian boarding schools, but for just any past experience like this, like the Christopher Columbus Day or the Japanese internment camps, anything similar to that. I believe that the objective perspective and also the hidden perspective should always be taught. All right, so getting into my reflection here, if students only learned the traditional version of Indian boarding schools, what would they miss? Obviously, they would miss all the silence perspectives of the Native Americans, right? So all of the how they had to how they were punished for not speaking in only English, or how they had their hair cut and assigned uniforms, and probably so many other things that we don't even know about, because those are perspectives maybe from the unmarked graves or from the Native Americans who were so brainwashed by these boarding schools that we'll just never know what happened. So it could have been so much worse, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was, basically. And then kind of leading into my second question, how might that shape their understanding of America and the purpose of education? This would basically lead them to think like the Euro American white culture it's not a two-sided coin. It's just the Euro Americans doing everything right, as most traditional narratives have uh, you know portrayed white culture and white people, like similar to Christopher Columbus Day and the Japanese internment camps. Like it's all uh, shaped to be justified, which is not entirely true. As we see, there's always two sides of the coin. There's always silence perspectives, and there's always people who have to get the short end of the stick, basically, and are mistreated, or whatever the case may be. And then here are my sources, and thanks.